Having spent a brief period in the political wilderness during the short reign of Liz Truss as Prime Minister, Suella Braverman was reappointed as Home Secretary by Rishi Sunak on the 25th of October 2022. Whilst none of the Conservative leadership can be said to have any compassion for the working class, especially not for migrants, like also reappointed Justice Minister Dominic Raab, Braverman typifies a particularly poisonous strand of Tory politicians, riven with naked ruling class hatred for the oppressed. Welcome back to FRFI video. These videos are made by the Birmingham supporters of Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, the newspaper of the Revolutionary Communist Group, and the script for this video comes from 3 articles of issue 291. British State, Racist State by Nikki Jameson, Black Deaths in Prison by Yara Osman, and Albania, Migration from the Destruction of Socialism by James Martin. You can find the links to those articles in the description down below. Now, let's get back to the video. The Rwanda plan of Braverman's predecessor Priti Patel is currently on hold pending the outcome of legal challenges and following the successful actions of campaigners and lawyers in June, preventing the first deportation flight to Rwanda from going ahead. The government has therefore been scouting around for other options, whereby it can either dump a sizable group of asylum seekers on another country or prevent them getting to Britain in the first place. On the 14th of November 2022, Braverman and French Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin signed an agreement whereby Britain will pay France £8 million more than it currently does for anti-migrant border policing on the northern French coast. Britain is an imperialist country which has looted and plundered half the world. Whether under the formal British Empire or, more recently, under the guise of NATO or other such formulations, it has bombed, occupied and wreaked havoc and environmental destruction. Yet, the people who flee that havoc are vilified and criminalised. Successive British governments, Labour and Tory, have made it increasingly difficult for most migrants and asylum seekers to enter and settle in Britain. This has of course led people to try other, riskier ways to arrive. More than 40,000 people have crossed the channel in small boats in 2022 so far. In 2021, the total was 28,526. In sharp contrast to the 123,000 people who arrived in Britain by plane between January 2021 and July 2022, under the Hong Kong British National Overseas Visa Scheme, who have been welcomed, housed and integrated. Those who come via the channel are deliberately characterised as an intractable problem only solvable by the most extreme methods. Enraged at the stalling of the Rwanda plan, in a speech to the Conservative Party conference on the 4th of October, Braverman pledged to go in even harder against both migrants and those woke people who stand in solidarity with them. She characterised this struggle as between the, quote, law-abiding majority and the mob. She reprised this on the 18th of October, railing against an imaginary coalition of enemies. Quote, it's the Labour Party, it's the Lib Dems, it's the coalition of chaos, it's the Guardian reading, tofu eating, wokerati. Braverman has sought to be even more ruthless than any of her predecessors. On the 1st of October, speaking to the right-wing tabloid The Sun, she launched an attack on people who claim asylum on the basis that they are victims of trafficking or modern slavery. Repeating this in a conference speech, Braverman claimed that they are gaming the system. The Modern Slavery Act 2015, through which victims of trafficking can claim asylum, was brought in by previous Home Secretary Theresa May. May is no woke liberal and was the architect of the hostile environment, which turned teachers, doctors, employers and landlords into immigration cops, who had to ask people's immigration status repeatedly and report any transgressors to the Home Office. Braverman's ruthlessness is not accompanied by efficiency or in-depth knowledge of her subject. Questioned by the Parliamentary Home Affairs Committee on the 23rd of November, she was incapable of explaining how an asylum seeker from a war-torn country would get into Britain by the safe and legal route that the Home Office insists are available as an alternative to entering illegally and claiming asylum on arrival. She also refused or was unable to answer questions about the Home Office's catastrophic mishandling of asylum seeker accommodation provision. Whatever Braverman says about its place in her imaginary woke coalition, the Labour Party is not mounting any opposition to the government's racist excesses. On the contrary, straight after Braverman's conference speech, Labour's Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves complained that the Conservative Party had no right to claim it would solve the migration problem, given that it had failed so far to deport anywhere enough people. Labour leader Keir Starmer called the increasing funding of French border controls a small step in the right direction, and told the BBC on the 6th of November in 2022 that the NHS was recruiting too many workers from overseas. "We don't want open borders," he said. "Freedom of movement has gone, and it is not coming back." Unlike the migrants from Hong Kong, who are welcomed with open arms, those who brave the dangerous channel crossing are given a hostile reception. This begins with an initial screening and processing at facilities dotted around the southeast area. Following earlier scandals around insanitary and overcrowded accommodation facilities at Napier and Penley Barracks, the Manston Holding Centre, located in a former military base in Kent, was opened in February 2022. On the base, it would house up to 1,600 people for around 24 hours each. From there, they would be moved to hotels or other accommodation. However, at the end of October, it was reported that there were over 3,800 detainees at Manston, some of whom who had been there for over a month, including families with small children. Protests, publicity and legal challenges around the inhumane conditions, including reports of diphtheria outbreaks, forced the Home Office to drastically reduce numbers. This in turn was botched, including newly arriving migrants simply being dropped off in London with no support. On the 19th of November, it was reported that a man held in Manston had died. As of the 22nd of November, Manston was empty, with everyone held there having been relocated. The stopping of the Rwanda flight and exposing of the conditions in Manston are victories against this racist government. We must build a real coalition of anti-racists and anti-imperialists which will give the likes of Braverman far more to fear than the imaginary one they are currently fighting a war against. We have to stand with asylum seekers and migrants. We have to say that no one is illegal, because an injury to one is an injury to all. Check out our website for more up-to-date and recent info on Britain's racist immigration laws. You'll find it in the Fight Racism section, or you can go to the latest edition section of the website, where you can also subscribe to upcoming issues. Of course, you can also get in touch with us to find out about getting yourself a copy of the paper in person.
In October 2022, the charity Inquest published a report detailing the effects of institutional racism on the prison estate, which reveals how even a short term in prison could spell a death sentence for ethnic minorities. The report shows that neglect of physical health in the prison system is highest among Black, Asian and mixed race people. This is also the case for neglect of mental health, including people of Eastern European background. Black and mixed race people in prison were actually affected the most in 6 out of 7 of the critical issues outlined in the report. Inappropriate use of segregation, racial stereotyping, bullying, victimization, and the failure to respond to warning signs, as well as neglect of physical and mental health. Numerous cases in this report provide examples of these issues, such as that of Annabella Landsberg, a 45-year-old mixed-race woman born in Zimbabwe and living in Britain. She was HIV positive, had type 2 diabetes, and sustained a brain injury as a result of tuberculosis. She arrived at HMP Peterborough after spending a few months at other women's prisons, and was often placed in segregation, with staff describing her behaviour as challenging. On 2nd of September 2017, Annabella was restrained and taken to segregation by an officer who had removed her body camera. There, she was observed on the floor unresponsive for the next 21 hours. The Prison and Probation Ombudsman's investigation into her death infers that the decision to place her into segregation was unwarranted. During the time she was on the floor of the segregation unit, discipline and healthcare staff assumed she was faking an illness. On the 3rd of September, staff observed that Annabella appeared to have wet herself and called for a nurse to check on her. Instead of assessing her, the nurse threw a cup of water over her, still claiming that Annabella was faking illness. Later that day, she was taken to hospital, where she was found to be severely dehydrated and suffering from multiple organ failure. Annabella died 3 days later. Winston Augustine was a 43-year-old mixed-race man who had a history of depression and drug use and was suffering from cancer. On the 28th of August 2018, Winston was transferred to segregation for 48 hours, with the door remaining locked the entire time. He was deprived of food, exercise, showers and phone calls, and was only given one low dose of pain relief medication, despite having been prescribed a daily dose. The day he got out of segregation, he was found hanging in his cell and pronounced dead. His body was in a state that suggested starvation, and pathologists estimated that he died 4 hours prior to being found. Tyrone Givens was a 32-year-old black man who was profoundly deaf and had a history of alcohol abuse, depression, self-harm and anxiety. He was remanded into police custody without his hearing aids and on the 7th of February 2018 transferred to HMP Pentonville, where 2 staff members noted that he was deaf and without hearing aids. No effort was made to obtain them or to accommodate Tyrone's disability. During the transfer, Tyrone expressed suicidal thoughts, but this was not recorded in the prison escort record. Over the next 2 weeks, Tyrone complained to family members that he felt unsafe in his wing due to his mattress being slashed, and he felt vulnerable without his hearing aids. Family members twice asked prison staff to look after him and reported the issue with the mattress, but an officer denied that Tyrone had said anything about feeling unsafe and wanting to be relocated. On the 26th of February, he was found hanging in his cell, and he died later that day. Back in March 2021, the government released a report from the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, which had been commissioned in response to Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. That report, which was widely criticised, concluded that Britain is not institutionally or systemically racist. This clear refusal by the government to acknowledge the existence of institutional racism is part and parcel of the neglect and brutality, which are reflected in the deaths of so many prisoners.
Albanian migrants are currently subject to a string of abuse by Britain's racist media, and it is therefore important to see how, since the overthrow of a post-war socialist government, the new market freedoms have led to a large exodus of workers from the country. The 1991 British census recorded only 338 Albanians in England. In 1993, this had risen to 2,500. By 1997, there are around 30,000. Currently, there are between 70 and 10,000. In the second quarter of 2022, Albanians became the largest nationality group claiming asylum in Britain, with applications at 3,289. In 2022, up to October, 12,000 Albanians arrived by small boat. In that same year up until June, 53% of Albanian asylum seekers' claims in Britain were granted in an initial decision. The intense propaganda and campaigns by Western imperialism against socialism,
the crusade for freedom is your chance and mine to fight communism,
waged particularly aggressively economically and militarily after the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the later creation of 20th century socialist states in Eastern Europe, eventually succeeded in reducing most of those achievements to ruins. By 1993, after the collapse of an enfeebled Albanian Party of Labour's stability government, the real GDP of Albania had fallen by more than 50% from its peak in 1989. The change in political control led to a dramatic fall in population growth rate, from just under 3% in 1990 to minus 1% in 2000 and 0.22% in 2021. By 2000, 6% of children under 5 suffered severe wasting, and the total wasting children figure was 12%. The rural population fell from 2 to 1 million between 1990 and 2020, in a total population in 2019 of 2.86 million. The collapse of the planned economy saw nearly 40% of the population leave Albania since 1991, heading for Greece, Italy, Germany, Scandinavia, Britain, and the US. The Civil War of 1997 created more misery. By 2000, an estimated 30,000 Albanian women were working as sex workers in Europe. Since 2020, a new wave of migration began, prompted in part by the COVID-19 pandemic and following the devastating earthquake of November 2019, which affected 10% of the population. The quake left over 12,200 people homeless, many until now. Little support was forthcoming from the government. Some 22% of the population lives below the poverty line, according to the World Bank. Food is always the biggest part of the budget of the poor, an estimated 42% in Albania, with fuel and travel to work, where available, at about 20%. Albania has one of the highest oil costs in Europe. The rest of the low family income is spent on the few other absolute necessities. With current inflation, this tragedy is deepening. Corruption, nepotism and patronage are endemic, destroying any sense of public responsibility and undermining faith in official institutions. After the collapse of the planned economy, the state distributed most of the country's land to citizens, but often without establishing absolute ownership rights. The state retains the power to take back any of the land, and in an uncertain political environment, removing certainty of ownership for private landowners. With the collapse of the Communist Party, this led to the use of bribes to keep property and allowed loan sharking, corruptions and organised crime to flourish. Foreign investors thus fight shy of placing capital in the country, though they have little reason to invest, given that the labour they need to exploit is compelled to move to the existing exploitive locations elsewhere in Europe. This labour theft allows the EU to go slow in giving Albania membership. Negotiations only began in 2022, following the start of the Ukraine war and the EU's need to counter Russian influence in the Balkans. Migration from economically ruined areas always leaves empty towns. The rural villages of Spain, France and Italy in the 20th century have long demonstrated this. Albanian towns and cities are suffering a continued exodus. Kukesi has lost 53% of its citizens, while Shkodra, Fieri, Gjoresi and Vlore have lost more than 50% in the past decade. During the period of communist government, many towns and villages had active economies based on mining and fishing. The removal of central planning and investment and shift to the anarchy of the market have left many unemployed. As ever, young men leave first. If they succeed in finding work, their families, always under difficult circumstances, may join them. Between 2008 and 2020, around 700,000 Albanians migrated to EU countries and now hold EU citizenship. Many others remain in the EU undocumented. The number who went elsewhere or do not have EU citizenship is not as clear. The situation is so serious that, with the average monthly wage estimated variously as anywhere between £221 and £460, about 83% of Albanians want to leave and nearly 50% are looking for jobs abroad. Remittances accounted for at least 31% of Albania's GDP in the second quarter of 2022. Those outside the country cannot vote and are excluded from any influence over domestic politics. In Britain, Albanian children are currently the second largest group receiving help from Bernardo's child trafficking support teams. Some are forced to work, particularly on building sites, but the majority are exploited for criminal activities. In a desperate attempt to attract any sort of money to act as capital, the Albanian government introduced changes to the law on private-public partnerships by including a golden passport scheme to encourage foreign investment. This copies Blair's 2008 UK scheme, which simply attracted thousands of lenders of dubious morality and which was abruptly modified in 2018 due to its embarrassing political exposure. In June 2022, the US Special Operations Command announced plans to locate a forward-based Special Operations Forces headquarters in Albania. Prime Minister Edi Rama declared that this was fantastic news. In the meantime, there's been no improvement in Albania's economy. Ghost towns remain empty, and the conditions of its abandoned working class stagnates. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far in the video, then you're one of the exceptional few, and it must mean that you really care about the issues raised and must want to help combat them. In that case, I want to encourage you to not only check out the links in the description below, subscribe to our newspaper and to the YouTube channel, but also to get in touch with us about getting involved. Come join our street actions, come join our FRFI supporters group meetings in planning protests, in having public discussion, and raising awareness and educating ourselves and each other and preparing ourselves to fight racism and fight imperialism.